This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News. And as we approach the next Borough Council election, this is one of the interviews we're having with the leaders or representatives of the parties currently at Guildford Borough Council. And now I'm with Paul Spooner, the leader of the Conservative group at GBC. Thank you for joining the Guildford Dragon, Paul.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, Martin.
And so straight into the questions then, what is your party's policy on the local plan? When will it be reviewed if you're in charge? And what changes will you be seeking?
Yeah, very good questions. Well, firstly, we still believe that adopting the local plan as soon as possible after the inspector recommended it for approval was the right move. And therefore, we also support, by the way, part 2 going through quickly, as has just happened at the council. The inspector expects it to happen quickly. So going back to part 1 and the site allocations, we still believe that in the main, it was the right decision and it was probably the right site allocations at the time. However, we did say at the time, and we still say today, that we tied infrastructure and healthcare, other facilities, utilities, etc., to delivery of the housing units. And we're not happy. We haven't been happy for several years in the progress that's been made overall. We called for a review going back now to 2020 on the basis that we thought that it did need to be looked at again in terms of the infrastructure. And we still therefore believe now that a review is of course approaching in terms of its regular timing, that it should have, it should be reviewed, and we should look very carefully at all of the priorities that we did enter into in terms of delivering the right housing as per the SHMA. And that hasn't changed, but what has changed is the time since 2019, the attitude from central government, although we haven't seen that mandated through the policies and any changes to the MPPF, MPPG, etc. But assuming that happens, I would say there's only one trajectory now, and that is actually a more protectionist approach from central government, which we as a Conservative group would be very happy to implement as quickly as possible. Okay,
so a couple of follow-ups on that. I mean, some people I think would say that we are seeing development ahead of infrastructure in certain areas, including I think around Ash, where your area. So what do you say to that? How can you ensure that the infrastructure comes first?
Yes, it's a very good point. So I think we have to split Ash and Tongham away to a degree, because that was already happening. The delays in the local plan from 2013 to 2019, one of the most negative points from that was the permissions that were being granted because there was no local plan in place. So we were running behind in terms of Ash and Tongham. And so many of the implementations that took place, or the site allocations, were on the back of what was happening with developers pushing for approval as soon as possible. And whilst as a council, we did actually refuse quite a few of those schemes. Under appeal, we unfortunately lost. Elsewhere, it's very different, because elsewhere the strategic sites are very slow in coming through, and there are developments that are primarily in areas that have been inset from the Greenbelt, for example, which tend to be relatively modest. Not necessarily modest for those people that live nearby, I have to say, but in the greater scheme of Guildford Borough, they're relatively modest. So the infrastructure has not fallen behind in any great area that the local plan was actually designed to protect, but there is a big danger of it. I know we've seen changes with Junction 10. That was looking like a significant issue a couple of years back and is now progressing. But you are right. There is a feeling, more perhaps than just a feeling, that the infrastructure that should be coming through ahead of development is not. And we're relying on promises which I think would worry every politician of every party.
Okay. And we're not going to see, or are you going to seek the return of some of the strategic sites to greenbelt protection? Is that even possible?
I think it's very unlikely that that can be done. There are different mechanisms and ways that you can protect greenfield and greenbelt sites. Obviously, when they've been removed from the greenbelt, they're no longer greenbelt, and that's one issue, and an issue that we were aware of and were concerned about back in 2019. So trying to roll back to reintroduce greenbelt or introduce new greenbelt, I think will be very difficult unless we see a significant change
In government policy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But as it stands at the moment, that would be very difficult. So you'd have to use other mechanisms, other means, and infrastructure or lack of infrastructure is the key one.
Okay, and just one further one on the local plan. With the benefit of hindsight, do you regret pushing it through at the end of the last administration?
No. And the reason we don't is because I truly believe that if we bounced it into the new administration time after May 2019, we probably still wouldn't have a local plan today. And that would have opened up the gates to unwanted development pretty much anywhere. So we believe, and strongly believe, that by effectively following the government mandate, which was to adopt as soon as possible after the inspector approved, we have saved a lot of potential problems in Guildford. The problem is you don't see that. You don't see what's actually been saved. But we do believe, and if I was in charge, we'd have done exactly the same again, Martin.
Okay, so will your party, continuing on the planning theme, will your party continue the work on shaping Guildford's future and the associated master plan?
This is a good question because, of course, we did put a considerable amount of money and time into the town centre master plan in Stephen Mansbridge's time before me, and then during my time. And the town centre master plan that Allies and Morrison were contracted to do for us looks remarkably similar to what we're seeing after £3 million being spent by the current administration. Is it of value? Well, I think our town centre master plan was of value. If we look at the Guildford Vision Group and we look at the concerns that they raised, and we had plenty of meetings with GVG over my time, there was talk of significant change within the town centre, removing a large building which is owned by Surrey County Council, putting a new bridge across. Now, they were fundamentally different, but we did not believe that they could actually viably be introduced into Guildford. Now, when we look at where they are in terms of the master plan or Guildford's future, as it's now termed, it seems to be coming back to being very similar to the original town centre master plan. So I guess the question here is, fundamentally, yes, it's important. Guildford needs master planning. So we buy into the principle. What we do not buy into is what we consider to be £3 million to actually go around the same circle and end up with pretty much the same position as we were in a good few years ago. So okay, to answer your question, we would need to think very carefully about whether it was worth continuing with the project as it stands now. But we do buy into the principle of something being agreed across Guildford to enable planning for the future. Okay,
now I'm sure you're aware that there's a video in circulation on social media, The Battle for Guildford by Robin Horsley. What's your view on that and your colleagues' view on that video?
It's it goes without saying that there were a few giggles within my party when we saw it. I mean, fundamentally,
giggles. Why giggles?
Well, because it's very well produced. It's a very well produced video, very professional looking, and it's unusual to see the residents for Guildford being given some criticism, to be perfectly honest. And so it was a bit of a surprise to see Robin Horsley producing such a document and asking questions. I think that some of the questions, not all, but some of the questions are worthy of being asked.
Which ones?
Well, I think the fundamental question about North Street, and I personally believe, I have a lot of respect for John Rigg, I mean, to be clear, but I believe that not enough listening went on, and it was pushed through as a developer's project rather than necessarily a community's project. I've no doubt that John and others would disagree, but I do feel, from sitting on the other side, that some of the criticism that the previous administration had in terms of not consulting widely enough is exactly what's happened here in relation to North Street.
But there was quite a lot of consultation on it, wasn't there? I mean, we were tracking it. What would you have done differently?
Well, for a start, the design. I think that.
No, I mean on the consultation. Sorry, is that what you mean?
No, I think that, well, the consultation was primarily stakeholder consultation. There was plenty of stakeholder consultation, but I think there should have been probably a wider remit. Not just the professionals or the experts need to be involved in a project that's as big as North Street. You need to have everyone looking at it. And there may be some very silly comments, and believe me, I've made quite a few of them in my time. But I do feel that there were opportunities missed. I wasn't listened to, that's for sure. It was quite clear to me that that Surrey County Council, by making the objections that they made, it was going to be very difficult to pull this through in terms of the approval. And of course, that proved to be the case. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who raised concerns. There would have been many people raising concerns. So I think it was pushed through. I mean, I've talked to the developer. I've met the developers since the refusal. And, they've made it quite clear to me that they were following what they believed that was direction from the planners, and also from from John Rigg and his colleagues. So I think that that was wrong. I think the wrong direction was given. That does not mean that I think that the scheme was so terrible that it should never have been put forward, but I was not surprised when it failed.
Okay. Now, one of the elements, of course, a major element within all that is the lack of a height policy in Guildford. So what would you do about that? Because it's still not there, is it?
Well, I've made these noises now, for some time, really. The Heights and Views SPD, we did back in 2017, 2018. Was it good enough? No, I think we now argue it was not, because it was not specific on heights.
It was just views, wasn't it?
We were focused on it's obviously tied to heights, because that the two go together. But we thought the fundamental protection needed to be to ensure that the views, or the important views in Guildford, were protected. I'm not even sure if that's been used. To be honest, Martin, I've asked questions and I do not know if that's been used. But did it go far enough? No, it didn't. And I think the Conservatives definitely admit now that if we'd been in power for the 4 years, we would have privatised actually making that stronger.
Okay, but what? I mean, the Conservatives have been dominant in local politics in the borough council for decades, and yet we've seen high buildings before. So why is it only now that you're worried about it?
It's not only now. I think I would say since Solent. The one thing that united Guildford Vision, Guildford society, the Conservatives, and pretty much everyone else was the Solent success, because no one wanted it. I certainly didn't want it. My party didn't want it. The opposition parties didn't want it, and the key stakeholders in Guildford didn't want it. But despite all of that, it got through on appeal, and I think that woke us up. But these things take incredibly long time, and we were pushing part one. There's no way that you could do that until you'd finished part one, and accept an SPD, which we did. But no inspector would have accepted a height study as a standalone. So it's part two, and it's part of what should have happened and been presented a very few weeks ago, when we agreed pretty much across the whole council to support part two of the local plan. But I think many parties and many councillors spoke on the fact that everyone had, of course, and they always will have concerns, but one thing
So
that
why
came
did you
across.
support part 2 if you had
I
that?
supported it because for the same reason I supported part 1 when I brought that forward, and that is there's a lot more positives than negative. If it had been voted down, we would have been left without the development management policies and lots of good management policies.
Okay,
You know,
so which of your colleagues spoke out that you needed this height policy during the debates on part 2?
pretty much when we had group meetings, pretty much everyone spoke out about it.
In group
David
meetings, but I'm talking about in the chamber.
No, in the chamber we talked about. I mean, I personally mentioned it, and I think David Bilby mentioned it as well. So in the chamber, you know, Conservatives raised concerns, but then voted for it, and I think that's appropriate opposition.
Okay. What now? Switching away from planning, but another major issue are the finances. It's not just affecting Guildford Borough Council, of course, across local government generally. But what can Guildford Borough Council do to increase revenue, given the generally parlous state of local government finances and the disappearance under your Conservative colleagues at national government level of the grants?
Well, obviously, we also had the experience of the grants disappearing under my time. And of course, it was quite depressing. Anyone in local government with any badge or colour, you know, wants to see adequate funding coming through.
Do you think that was right by the national government to do that?
No, I've always said I don't agree. I think local government is far more important than just being part of the cuts. So no, I don't agree. However, where I think that we've gone wrong is in our priorities. This is something that actually Julia McShane, the leader of the council, and I agree on. And that is that it's very important, particularly when you've got diminishing cash or income coming in, to make sure you get your priorities right. And this is the issue again, where we talk about master planning. You know, did we need to spend all that money on master planning? Personally, I think not. Did we need to spend some money on it? Absolutely. So I'm not saying it should be cut. And if I was still there, or colleagues of mine were still there, Nigel Manning in particular, who's very good on local government finance, I think that we would not be in the pickle that we're currently in. You know, the prioritisation is key to this. There's only so much money coming in. That's true, Martin. And if that money's going down, then obviously it makes it more and more difficult. But that means privatisation is probably the only difference between the parties. The Lib Dems have clearly demonstrated with the Hive and things, while making cuts in Ash, that they've made some difficult decisions. Disappointing for me, but understandable, in the sense that if you've only got so much in the pot, you need to try and work out the best way to deliver. And they chose Central Guildford.
But you haven't said yet how you could raise more money.
Well, it's not, because it's quite difficult. You know, the easiest way to raise money is parking and things like that. But let's be honest, we have to protect the economy. And one thing that we were very focused on in the previous administration was a visitor strategy and the economic drive in Guildford. So putting car parking up very quickly increases revenues unless people stop coming in. And then, of course, it's a different story. So it's the balance. And we can go across the council pretty much through every element of council responsibility at borough level. And we can look at things where we can tinker. But tinker is the key word, because it doesn't matter who is currently, you know, responsible for finances in Guildford. It's difficult. And when it's difficult,
Isn't the problem that the cake is just not big enough?
The cake is not big enough for all that we want to achieve in Guildford,
or even maintaining the services you have provided in the past.
I think that that's a difficult question, because we don't have the kind of access now that we had, obviously, when we were leading the council. So it's very difficult to make judgment. But from an opposition perspective, I do believe that errors have been made. I believe that they're having to restate the accounts, which presumably will happen after the election. So there are errors that have happened, and I do genuinely feel that the Conservatives would have taken a very pragmatic approach and been more careful in, for example, capital versus revenue. And mistakes have been made where it's been assumed that capital expenditure could be applied, and now it's not the case, so it will be a revenue cost and a restatement. Things like that, I truly believe would not have happened under our time. That doesn't mean we didn't ask the question, because I remember very well in 2015 asking questions about what can we put down and capitalise in terms of our plans. But I was told very clearly and directly that we could not do that. I don't understand what's gone wrong, for example, in the recent year or two, that message didn't get through.
Okay, but why should voters trust? You're part of the Conservative Party, and they are the ones that have cut the grants. So there's a dichotomy here, isn't there? Why should they trust what you're saying now as opposed to your national colleagues?
Well, we are one party, but we're very different from on a local level to national level. It doesn't really matter whether the national government is Labour, Conservative, or something else. At a local government level, everyone is autonomous, and that applies across all parties. So I can be quite critical of national government position in relation to local government, but I'm very supportive of many other policies.
Okay. Now, some say GBC is not doing enough to prioritise measures to address climate change. What would your party do differently, if anything?
To be honest, I think this is one of the success stories, and there's no sense in just beating down everything that everyone tries to achieve. And I think that this administration has taken forward what we were achieving. I mean, it wasn't a case that we didn't have a climate change board, although it would appear so from some of the comments that we hear. We did have one. My former colleague, Councillor Jackson, put a lot of effort in to moving that forward. I think Jan Harwood put a lot of effort in when he became a Lib Dem councillor. And I think that now George Potter is putting a lot of effort in terms of driving it forward as chairman. So I think that there are successes that should be appreciated, and that's one. I think the climate change agenda, how serious Guildford Borough Council has taken it, is a credit to this administration.
So you wouldn't do anything differently. You just carry on what's happening.
I think that we would pretty much have followed what's happened now. We started it on its path. It's been taken forward in a very positive way. There's a significant concern, whoever's running the council, and that's the cost of it, and that needs to be looked at very carefully. But I think that's unfortunately is a challenge that needs to be tackled.
And isn't the truth that there's only so much a local council can do, and the changes that some people feel are required need to be led at national level?
Most of our focus within GBC, whether it was 2015, 2019 or 2023, is on what the council can do and how the council can, number one, get its own house in order, and number two, support the local community to get their house in order. That's all we can do. Everything else, the bigger picture, international picture and national picture, is beyond us, but we can do our own bit.
Okay. Now, finally, how will and this is, we know, a bone of contention with many people in Guildford across the political spectrum. I don't think it's how will your party improve customer services at GBC, especially in the areas of processing planning applications and responding to customer inquiries? Obviously, there's a link to the finances here, but how would you tackle that?
Well, Martin, this is where I do sound typically political, because my immediate response is not get into the mess that the council got into in the first place. When we shut the door of the leadership suite, planning was top 10 in the country, and in terms of development management, and customer service was working very well. It is beyond belief that we've managed to get to the position that we have got into over the course of a few short years.
Bottom of the National League, or near, around the bottom.
Well, bottom in terms of planning, and also the very poor customer service. Now, I started the journey as well with my colleagues on looking at change management in Guildford and improving efficiencies. But I always said to the former Chief Executive, James Whiteman, that one thing we must make sure that we do not do is under-resourced to a point where we watch as people suffer and the services fail. And I think that's something that is extremely disappointing. What would we do if we came in? We'd fix it as soon as we possibly could. But I don't believe that we would have got it, or at least if we had created the position that we've seen over the last year or two, then we shouldn't have been in power. It's as simple as that.
So what would you do?
We would have made sure that there was adequate.
No. What would you do now if you got into power in May? What would you do?
We're going to have to throw some money at it. As simple as that. I mean,
and where does that come from?
Well, there's no money tree, that's for sure. But to be honest, customer service, providing the important services to the community, come first. So if you're asking me, would I cut the expenditure on some of the other capital items, etc., which anyway are now revenue cost, then probably we'd have to. That's what we would be looking to do.
Okay, which projects do you have in mind?
You know, it's unfair of me to make comment on specific projects when we've been out of the loop for 4 years. So what I would say to you, Martin, is that we would spend 3 months actually reviewing all of the current projects. Some of them are very, very useful, very, very worthy. But if they are costing too much to the community to be able to deliver our vital services, then we're going to have to do something. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Councillor Paul Spooner, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.